So hi everyone, so welcome to this episode of Rightful Lives vlog, which this week is about psychological restraint.
Hi, Salli Midgely. I'm the Director of Nursing Quality and Professions at Sheffield Health and Social Care Trust.
I'm Dawn.
Hi, I'm Dr. Dawn Cavanagh, and I'm an academic, and I also am the mother of Jack, who is 20 now, and he has a learning disability, autism, ADHD and epilepsy, and he's currently in a psychiatric intensive care unit.
So I guess, first of all, it's probably worthwhile having a little think about what psychological restraint is. So basically, it's any kind of communication strategy. So we're talking, it could be like written, it could be verbal communication, it could be non-verbal, like facial expressions, hand gestures, eye contact, hugs, smiles, head nods, and even stuff that's within sort of environments like key cards, locked doors, things like that. So any kind of communication strategy that puts psychological pressure on people to do something they don't want to do or stop them doing something they do want to do. So when I was in inpatient units, this was like probably the most prevalent, I would say, form of restraint, which actually is just not really paid much attention to. So as I said, we're really pleased to have Salli here because she's commissioned quite a big piece of work on this with a quite comprehensive resource set to take a look at it. So Salli, why did you commission this work?
Thanks. So, I commissioned it on behalf of Sheffield Health and Social Care Trust, and actually it came out of work we did nationally. I used to work in the national team around restrictive practices, and I think where we started with some of those interventions that were easier to get hold of, easier to count, so seclusion, segregation, but actually recognition that as you've described, there are ways of behaving and just ways of working within the system that mean that psychological restraint is quite prevalent, but it's actually really difficult to talk about. I think it's quite difficult sometimes for people to reflect and recognise. So I did initially talk to the system, and a number of providers are very interested in the work. But when it came down to the commissioning, that's where my executive team colleagues, and I have to declare, I'm a trustee of the RRN, so I did need to ask my colleagues that would we support this work, because we feel really strongly that we need to have a conversation about psychological restraint. So that's why we commissioned it, but it's for everybody. It's to really raise awareness around how the system particularly can interfere and impact on how the people who come to use our services are supported.
Yeah, thanks, Salli. And I mean, are we sort of talking here about, for parent carers and people that are watching, people that are watching this, are we talking about sort of counting every restraint? What's the point of it really?
So in terms of things like physical restraint, the laying of hands on, secluding, segregation, there is a requirement, as hopefully many of people who watch this will know. So and that's relatively, well, it should be easy to monitor because staff know when they've done those things. I do still think we have issues about the transparency of data. However, certainly in Sheffield, we're really clear around our responsibilities to do that. But as you've described, some of the methods and, even the presence of people when you're talking about medication, for example, that becomes inferred about what you expect people to do, that's much more tricky, isn't it, to actually have a conversation about, never mind start thinking about how we might monitor that. So this work was about starting the conversation, raising people's awareness around how it's really disempowering, and the things that I think, I'm a nurse, the things that I've done in the past, and to think about actually how that might feel to be on the other end of, and you might not intend it, but how it feels for those individuals.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting, Salli, because like on Rightful Lives, what we often find is, it's linked to things like blanket restrictions, or it's linked to other forms of restraint, like you're saying. So a common one that comes up with parent carers and people that are in services in our campaign group is visits being monitored, you know, so having a staff member in there with a pad and a piece of paper, you know, so you've got that blanket restriction there, haven't you? But parents will say, I don't know what they're writing down. I don't want to speak. I don't want to, you know, I'm not allowed. I feel like I can't hug or say what I want to say because there's somebody sort of in that room. So you have got that psychological pressure element, which I think is restricting people in that way. I know, Dawn, you've got a couple of examples, haven't you, that you've experienced with Jack?
Yeah, it's very interesting because from the example you've just given, Alexis, that's not just the person being psychologically restrained, that's also the family as a whole, isn't it? So I think for Jack, yeah, I mean, there's so many examples. I can think of one where he was being coerced. So, well, the member stuff actually did get removed from Jack, but he was being told that if he didn't take his medication or didn't do this, that he'd be sent to the principal's office, but he didn't actually know what that meant. So he was just frightened of this place where he was going to be sent. And I think she also threatened him with Father Christmas not coming. So that was another example. And I think there are other things that we don't think about, like just, for example, he got very frightened of alarms because if an alarm got triggered, then it meant that there'd be an emergency, a response, and it could potentially mean that he was put into restraint. So just seeing an alarm or hearing jangling of keys, it would be a reminder of doors being locked or potentially something happening. And I do remember speaking to one family where they said that their son was threatened with not seeing mum and dad if he didn't behave. So I just think there's so many examples. One thing I was going to ask Sally, if that's okay, was when you think about psychological restraint, we don't talk about it very much, but it clearly contravenes the Human Rights Act in so many ways, so many articles. So in terms of mental suffering and the degrading treatment, in terms of right to liberty and security, in terms of the right to a family and private life and your personal development and freedom of thought and conscience. And I just wondered what are your thoughts around that, Sally?
Good question, and that speaks to really, I think, why in joining Sheffield Health and Social Care, why I'm going to go off on a slight tangent, but why we employed a human rights officer, because I think that's the element of training, of development, of for our staff to be able to think about and consider human rights in full, because that's that link through, as you say. A lot of the words you use then in describing actually some really shocking examples, you use the word threaten, and that's where you know that something's not quite right, is it, in terms of human rights. So they're absolutely linked. I feel really strongly that we don't work enough around the human rights legislation and use that framework to think about the ways in which we work with people who come to our services for care and their families and carers, significant others, and the impact and limitations that we can have that actually, when they're put under scrutiny, don't hold up. So the role of certainly Talin, who works with us on human rights, is really, really vital for all the reasons that you've said, Dawn. And this work absolutely links through, and that's what we need to do. We need to have the conversation, but the reflection needs people who are informed by human rights to help, because sometimes when you're in the heat of things and you're, you know, staff might be thinking about thinking of some of those medication examples. Of course, there is, at times there will be a legal framework that might support the giving of medication against somebody's will, but the steps you take before that absolutely need to be proportionate, don't they? And they can't involve, you know, coming and saying, will you have this, with a team of 5 people behind you? That's an absolute implied threat that's in all likelihood going to get followed through. So I think for me, it's the raising of awareness and just supporting people to stop and think. But some of those other examples you've given, you know, telling somebody, you know, a child, Father Christmas won't come, there's no place for that. That shouldn't be in the language, you know, that if you don't do X, this will happen. That's, yeah, that really shocked me, actually.
I mean, Salli, some of it's abuse, isn't it? I mean, this is what Talon says, isn't it? And actually, Sally's commissioned, for those of you that are watching, a legal rights framework. So if parent carers and people in services are interested, you can look at that and see exactly where this stuff fits in with the law. But some of it's clearly abuse, isn't it? But others is just kind of embedded in what happens. Do you have any examples of that, Salli, that you could let sort of parents know about?
Gosh. Let's say, well, I suppose it's that interface, isn't it, with the Mental Health Act, where somebody's detained and we do have the ability to enforce treatment, I guess, but that's a fine line, isn't it, as to when you come to enforcement versus, as I said, that pre-work around how you might work with somebody. I mean, some of the examples there around the leave, that's something that I think we do hear a lot, and I used to hear a lot in the national team. You know, if you do X, you can have your leave. Actually, those two, they shouldn't be used together in that way, and that is how the Human Rights Act then would support those conversations. If somebody, you know, I think on the Talking Heads, there's examples around self-harm, isn't there? That doesn't help somebody who's self-harming to say, if you stop self-harming for a week, you can have leave. That they should not go together. You should be able to have your leave in line with your rights. And the conversations about self-harm for somebody in distress need to be separated, and not a prize or something or a punishment. That is not how we should be using leave. But I think, people clearly lose their way, don't they? So I think using the framework around human rights just helps you to rebalance your thinking.
Yeah, sure. And I think for me, like, even when I was like initially detained, it's like, okay, so I've got this act which says I can't leave this place. I've got all these locked doors. I've got a key card that only opens my room. I can't open anywhere else. I've got the nurse's office, which is this goldfish bowl of glass where they're staring at me the whole time. I've got CCTV, you know, all over the place, kind of looking at me. And I think all of that stuff's kind of embedded in the environment. And that is all psychological pressure, which is sort of saying to me, actually, I'm quite powerless, you know, in this situation. So I think that's already going on, that kind of stuff that's already kind of in the environment. But then, of course, we've got this, like you're saying, basically threats, isn't it? They're basically threats which are interfaced in some kind of way with other legal frameworks that they need to be supported appropriately. I mean, what should be happening, Salli? What should staff be doing, do you think?
I'm just going to go back to one on environment. Actually, it's really important, and I think again, because every hospital, it must be really difficult as a carer, as a service user, because as you move through different hospitals or providers, you'll get a very different experience, won't you? So, I'm thinking about in Sheffield. You know, we've worked really hard. We don't use CCTV a lot. We won't use the monitoring systems. You know, there's a lot of things that we don't do, and so when you're asking me those questions because they're not commonplace for us, but obviously you could go somewhere else and have lots of surveillance and lots of those kind of sort of restrictions. Obviously we have some blanket restrictions, but that inequity and just demonstrates actually that they're not requirements by law. It is a choice of that particular system as to how much of these things they use, and it is possible to do it in a different way. But on that point, I know what Talon, our human rights officer, would talk about is that the mental health system, it's, you know, the level of power it has over individuals is only equitable in the immigration system and the prison system. So, you know, there's a lot of power for people, and therefore we should be really, really careful about how we use it, because but the difference should be that we're aimed around the treatment and intervention and our relationships with people to support them to, you know, hopefully to improve to a point where, because we're talking mainly about inpatient services, where they can go back home and live a rightful life. So, but I think sometimes that's lost, isn't it? And that's what we see in these documentaries, where those checks and balances aren't in place. So going back to this work, that's why these conversations, these reflections, we don't all have to agree, but if we're having conversations about our use of power and our use of interventions that potentially are legal, but are really discriminatory potentially against people, then it helps, doesn't it? I think it's about for me, it's about us having reflective practitioners who will really think about what they do. That's the aim of this work from my perspective.
Just the final question really was, if people in services are finding that this is happening, that these kind of more, I think the threat aspect is probably abuse. Salli, would you agree?
Yeah.
Threatening is not okay. If you do X, Y is going to happen. That's not, shouldn't be happening at all. What can people do? What, obviously we've got this resource kit, is available now. What can families, people in services do to challenge this kind of practice if they're experiencing it?
So I would, I'd like to think that there's an opportunity to have a conversation with those teams and point them to the resources. As you say, some of the examples are abuse, and actually when we showed the resources internally, a lot of our clinical team straight away said, well, that's not psychological restraint, that's abuse. And that's great, isn't it? Because it's like, right, good, okay, so that's the base we're starting from. So some providers might have different conversations and may not recognise that. So I think there are other forms of support available, aren't there? I would hope that people have got access to good advocacy, both either internally but also external advocates to seek advice around human rights. Where possible, advocates should be aware of that. I think potentially there's the CQC as well. I think it's the usual forms of escalation and seeking support. The world of commissioning's moved on slightly, but you should still have those place level commissioners and your integrated care board who should be interested if you've got concerns about the treatment and care of those people, of your loved ones in the service. But I would hope that actually being able to point the provider or the team to these resources, it's the conversation, is it? It's the raising of awareness and getting people to think about things when we're talking about psychological restraint, but you have to report abuse.
Thank you so much, Salli. And just to remind people watching as well that probably the rights-based document would be really useful for the stuff that Sally's just mentioned there, because it's got in there about the Equality Act, it's got in there about the Human Rights Act and the Capacity Act, and how those things might interface in other ways with the Mental Health Act. And that's been written by Dr. Talon Gray of Sally's Trust.